Attention all true crime fanatics. Welcome to the Open Homicide Podcast. Please join us as we examine contentious and controversial narratives of famous homicides from around the world. We dig deeper, we question the official story, and we discuss alternative theories. Here now is the host of our show, Skip Pulley.
Welcome to the Open Homicide Podcast. I am your host, Skip Pulley. Thank you for joining us for part one of a very special two-part episode about the quote-unquote wrongful death of Princess Diana of Wales. This episode is sponsored by Bamboo 92 FM, listener-supported community radio in Charlotte, North Carolina. To subscribe to the Bamboo 92 YouTube channel, follow the link in the description, or you can visit bamboo92.com. So let's go over briefly the official story about the automobile accident, quote unquote, that took the life of Lady Diana. So essentially, they were in a Paris hotel. She and her boyfriend, I guess you could call him a boyfriend, Dodi Al-Fayed, left the hotel along with Henri Paul, who was a member of the security detail who was driving, and a guy named Trevor Rees-Jones, who was also part of the security detail. So Henri Paul was driving, Trevor Rees-Jones was in the front passenger seat. Dodi Al-Fayed was behind Henri Paul in the back seat and Diana in the back passenger seat. They left the hotel, and then the stories become a bit convoluted because the official story has actually changed over the years. Now you got to keep in mind, the so-called quote-unquote inquest investigation took 10 years. In fact, it's still ongoing. So there was a lot of reluctance by both the French police and the British authorities to even get involved and believe something suspicious had happened. But the first story was that they were driving away from the hotel in order to go to Dodi Al-Fayed's apartment. The paparazzi was following close behind them. They went into a tunnel for some strange reason that was actually going away from Dodi's apartment in the opposite direction. And the original story was that some paparazzi on motorcycles got in front of them. So as the paparazzi were flashing photographs, the original official story was that Henri Paul lost control of the vehicle and it smashed into a concrete pillar in the tunnel, killing both himself and Dodi Al-Fayed, and supposedly eventually killing Diana, who supposedly died at the hospital sometime that morning. So that was the original story. Subsequently, the story came out that as the paparazzi were swarming around them in motorcycles, etc., there was a white Fiat Uno driving parallel to the Mercedes, which was going suspiciously fast, according to the official story. I don't know if you can imagine a white Fiat Uno keeping up with the Mercedes. I suppose it doesn't matter that it's white, but a Fiat Uno getting in it step for step with the Mercedes is a little bit difficult to believe, because the eyewitnesses claim that that's what happened. They didn't claim that the Mercedes gained on the Fiat driving kind of slow in the right lane. They basically described it as if the two were in some type of drag race. So essentially, the second story that came out was that the white Fiat Uno had cut off the Mercedes that Henri Paul was driving and caused it to swerve into the pillar. So after that, the, I guess, third and fourth and fifth official stories involved somehow, as if by magic, all of a sudden, Henri Paul, the driver, was drunk, even though no one had seen him drinking at the hotel. He was acting suspiciously, but not necessarily intoxicated, according to the camera footage, and there is no eyewitness accounts of him being drunk. But then that's the story that they came up with. So they were very reticent to even rule it anything other than an accident, but eventually it was ruled as a wrongful death. So let's start off with a segment that we like to call Did You Know FYI? And it's bits and pieces of information that have been verified or confirmed, but are not necessarily a part of the official story or the official narrative. So, did you know that there are conflicting accounts of who was actually first on the scene? There are some eyewitnesses who gave statements that are not a part of the official investigation, and the story has changed quite a few times. So, very mysterious. Another did you know is that exact same car crash scenario was actually on file with intelligence agencies, MI5, MI6, CIA, SAS, as a potential assassination plot. And the declassified documents actually show that plan was originally developed to assassinate Slobodan Milosevic, who was at that time president of Serbia, who they were looking to basically eliminate for mutual shared interest, etc., etc. Did you know that the ambulance ride from the crash scene to the hospital took 1 hour and 43 minutes when the nearest hospital was 10 minutes away? We'll get pretty in-depth into that because there are some French laws and regulations that state that accident victims have to be attended to at the scene prior to getting in the ambulance. Once they're in the ambulance, though, it should be all hands on deck to get them to a facility, and that story's changed also. There's stories that have come out that said that the doctor, the ranking attending ambulance physician, which I didn't even know that was a thing, but they can sometimes overrule the other ambulance staff or the ambulance crew and the driver and say, no, we're not going to this hospital. We have to go to this other hospital because of such and such or blah, blah, blah. But this is the former Princess of Wales. I mean, it's not, you have to move with alacrity once you get into the hospital. So that alone led a lot of people to believe that she may have been killed in the ambulance prior to arriving at the hospital. Did you know that Jeffrey Epstein has ties to the royal family, both through Prince Andrew and Gary Goldsmith, who is, I believe, Kate Middleton's uncle? Kate is now, if I'm not mistaken, the current Princess of Wales, which is an ironic parallel. We'll see how it goes for her. I don't know much about that other than it was a very creepy wedding between she and William, who I guess now is the Prince of Wales. Did you know that there were a total of 4 different coroners assigned to do the inquest over the years? And that is a lot of coroners to do an inquest, and we'll get into that. Did you know that the Mercedes-Benz that was involved in the crash, the 4 of them were riding in, was a substitute? Apparently, when they went out the back door, it was Dodie, Diana, Henri Paul, and Trevor Rees-Jones, and they were about to get into the Mercedes to go to Dodie's apartment. Apparently, a brand new Mercedes would not start. That's what they're telling us. That's the official story. Now, if you're any type of security person and you don't go down beforehand to make sure the car starts, you are not a very good security person. Okay? It's very, very suspect here. I mean, we're getting into some seriously murky waters. Brand new Mercedes. And so they apparently just had another backup standing by. They didn't even have to wait. They were like, oh, this one won't start, but let's just take this one over here that happened to be here. So, yeah, we'll get into that as well. And finally, did you know that apparently for the first time in her entire adult life, Princess Di did not have on a seatbelt? That is the official story. This is something that she did religiously. This is something that most people, including myself, do unconsciously every time you get into an automobile without question. It's just ingrained. And it's something, according to her friends, family, and everyone who knew her, regardless of where she was sitting or what type of vehicle it was. I don't know if that dumb carriage has seat belts. I have that would be another question. The horse-drawn thing with the the creepy Poseidon tridents and all the other Luciferian decoupage. I'm not sure. But, you know, everyone who puts on a seatbelt unconsciously on a religious basis would understand that that's something you do, and that's probably not something that she would have done unless it was broken. And if it was broken, I imagine she would have caused a real scene about it. Or she would have just switched seats with Dodie. It's like, hey, my seatbelt's broken. I always wear a seatbelt. Also, Trevor Rees-Jones, who again was the sole survivor of this crash and whose memoirs are complete disinformation, who also, by the way, has ties to intelligence organizations. It was his job to make sure she was buckled up and, you know, always had her seatbelt on. So apparently he didn't do that either. So he didn't check the car to see if it would start, and he didn't make sure she had her seatbelt on. So this guy is doing a bang-up job. I mean, this guarding a princess, I don't understand that. He must have submitted his resume as confetti. I have no idea. So before we get into any of the interviews and clips regarding eyewitness testimony and details about the quote-unquote accident, let's get into a little bit of background about Di and Dodie and how this whole thing supposedly came about. So as early as October 1996, Diana was writing and speaking openly about her fear of being killed. That's a red flag. I mean, that's something that, a lot of people believe in coincidence, that she could have this fear that she would die in a car accident or die as a result of being in a car that was in an accident, and then everyone being led to believe that it was in fact an accident and not intentional. That's a hell of a coincidence. That's one that it's difficult for me to get over. So Diana and Dodie knew each other for a long time. They actually met in 1986 when Dodie was in a polo match with Goofball Charlie. I don't know if it was a tournament or it was just a friendly. I'm not sure. I don't know much about polo. And he met Diana and flipped. But of course, you know, he was married at the time with children and that whole chestnut. But the point is, they knew each other for a long time and they were friends. And they had a lot of time to grow close to each other, and definitely close enough to have possibly at least one or two affairs during that time. I mean, it is possible. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Charlie was definitely having affairs, so there's a lot of evidence that Diana was like, you know, I'm not just going to sit here and take this. So she might have been doing what she had to do as well. So before we get into their whirlwind romance in the summer of 1997, let's hear a little bit of background about Dodie Al-Fayed.
Dodi Fayed was the final love of Princess Diana's life. Their whirlwind romance became a front-page tabloid fixture. But who exactly was the Egyptian-born multimillionaire? Born in 1955 in Alexandria, Egypt, Dodi was the eldest child of wealthy tycoon Mohammed Al Fayed, then the owner of Harrods department store and Fulham FC. In 1979, he formed the production company Allied Stars. Dodi Fayed became the chief executive of the company. He produced Oscar winners such as Chariots of Fire and Steven Spielberg's Hook. He was linked to many high-profile individuals, including Julia Roberts, Winona Ryder, and Tina Sinatra. In 1986, the then Prince Charles played a polo match against Fayed. This is where he first met Diana, Princess of Wales. In the summer of 1997, Dodi's father invited Diana aboard their yacht in Saint-Tropez. It became the focal point of the tabloid frenzy that ended in disaster. On the 31st of August 1997, Dodi and Diana were killed in a car crash.
Now, remember and keep in mind the fact that Dodi ran a very successful production company. That fact, combined with some of the facts about Jeffrey Epstein and the Goldsmith connection and the Prince Andrew connection, are why this show took so long to get together and why it's actually in 2 parts. Because the basis of part 2 is really going to blow your mind for you guys that are into a lot of, I guess, celebrity conspiracies and things like that. Because the basis of part 2 of this episode is actually based on the fact that Diana wasn't a Spencer, that she was actually a Goldsmith, that her pop was not really her pop. Now, you got to understand, the relationship between the Spencers and the Windsors was almost like master-slave. So there are not a lot of reasons why the Windsors would have agreed to having Charlie marry her if she was in fact a Spencer. However, if she did turn out to be a Goldsmith, and she looks a lot like them, Goldsmith's kids, I think the middle son, she looks almost exactly alike. They could be twins. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why the Windsors and the Goldsmiths would want to connect and be included in the royal hocus pocus or whatever they have going on. And we'll get into that in part 2, all about these families that are part of these quote-unquote so-called royal bloodlines, like the Astors and the Goldsmiths and the Mountbattens and the Windsors and blah, blah, blah. You have to look at it this way. From Diana's point of view, in 96, 97, she was paranoid, and with good reason, because, you know, the Windsors play for keeps, and the Goldsmiths and all these other people, you know, they don't fool around. MI6, you're dealing with a lot of serious artillery now. And from the testimony of Diana's closest friends, she was really paranoid, which is probably why she started dating Hasnat Khan, the doctor. That was early 97. Now, supposedly, they broke up in early July 97. Khan said that it was his idea, but I suspect that he is lying. Diana told all her friends that she dumped him because he was acting weird and creepy, and he wanted more from her than she wanted from him. He also has ties to intelligence organizations. So Diana's got a right to be paranoid. Her paranoid intentions are justified. Let's say it like that. So basically, if she's paranoid and she sees herself as being maybe in need, I don't know, that's a strong term, but maybe if she's looking for a so-called protector, then definitely Mohammed Al Fayed, who was Dodi's pop, yeah, when he came on the scene, I mean, you're talking about a lot of money now. I mean, their family's prestigious. He owns Harrods department store. She had already known Dodi for several years. So that summer, Mohammed Al Fayed invited her and her sons to, you know, vacation on his yacht for a couple of weeks. And supposedly that's when the romance with Dodi begins. And we're going to get into a lot of other things about, her possible pregnancy. The one thing I want to go ahead and address is some of these books that I've read, I don't know where they're coming from in terms of knowledge of the human body or anatomy, but a lot of people are saying who believe in the official story that, oh, well, that wasn't enough time for her to know she was pregnant, or that's assuming that she did know, by the way. In one book was like, that wasn't enough time for her to get pregnant. I don't know if you know how women get pregnant, but it doesn't take a couple of weeks. You can make a reasoned argument that it only takes a few seconds. So I have no idea where you're coming from with that stuff. She could have easily been pregnant, whether she knew or not. I mean, maybe we'll never know. But the biggest red flag about that is that her body was embalmed almost immediately after she was pronounced dead, which would destroy any pregnancy test, which would also contaminate any type of blood test that you're trying to do for a tox screen. Huge red flag. And, by the way, very illegal according to French law and French regulation. And anybody who's seen an episode of Law and Order knows that when you embalm that body right away, you're trying to hide something from investigators that you don't want them to know. So let's take a quick mailbag break and hear from someone who has a question about the inquest.
Soundgirl612 writes, why did it take 10 years to hold an inquest? Why were so many different coroners involved?
So that's a really interesting question. Why did it take 10 years to hold an actual official inquest? The last person involved in heading up that inquest was someone named Scott Baker. So he's Justice Scott Baker, but he's the one who finally ruled it as a, quote, unlawful killing, unquote. So it at that time was not an accident, but also not necessarily a murder or manslaughter. That could have been a compromise on his part. He wasn't ready to rule it as a murder, so he also didn't want to have it go in the books as an accident. Maybe his conscience got to him, who knows. But basically, there were 4 different coroners all throughout this. So from, I guess, 97, from 1997 to 2007, there were 4 different coroners. So the first coroner apparently died either mysteriously or naturally before he could even start. So he was on the case, they were going to start the inquest, and this guy just dies, okay? The second coroner was this guy, Lord Stevens. When he took over, people were all of a sudden optimistic. They're like, yeah, we're going to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to get some answers. But this guy turned out to be essentially a political shill. This guy is the one who began starting a lot of the controversial changes in the official story and things that we initially heard about. This guy was like, oh no, everyone was mistaken. This is actually what happened. And his document was called the Stevens Report, and we'll hear more about that a little bit later on. But essentially, in a nutshell, this guy backed up the official story with his report and then quit and left office. That was the end of it. So that was the second coroner inquest. The third coroner actually wanted to do a family court style inquest. Now, this is interesting because anyone who has, again, if you've watched crime shows on TV or you yourself have been part of the criminal justice system, or just if you've gone through something as simple as a divorce or a custody hearing, you would then know that family court has a lot more leeway, I suppose, in presenting certain types of evidence and things that may have evidentiary value in family court don't necessarily have them in criminal court. It's almost as if you were watching one of the court TV shows, and again, you got to understand, eventually this was ruled as a wrongful death. So a lot of wrongful death lawsuits, for example, that are heard in court, and no one has to prove anything beyond a reasonable doubt. You just have to show proof with the preponderance of the evidence. So the third coroner who requested that type of inquest had his motion denied by whatever authority in Britain does that. So when the motion for that was denied, he just quit. He said, I don't want to do it. If I can't do it the way I want to do it and, get parts of the investigation admitted that weren't admitted before, then I don't want to do it. I'm out. All right, so then we come to the fourth coroner, who is this guy, Justice Scott Baker. And he is the one who actually did include some of the previously excluded evidence. But again, it could have just been a compromise. It could have just been him, playing the middle and trying to smooth things over. So some of the interesting things that came out of the inquest, the first one to me was that Lord Stevens, for the Stevens report, went out of his way to tell Henri Paul's parents that he wasn't drunk and not to worry about it because that was just a rumor. Then 3 weeks later, he actually made an announcement that he was drunk, and that was the whole reason that the thing happened. So he had told several people prior to that he wasn't. Not that he thought that he wasn't, or, let's wait for the blood test to come back. He literally said, no, we looked into it. He wasn't drunk. Don't worry about it. Some people said he was just trying to comfort his parents, but I don't think so. I mean, that's not his job. And why would he even be doing that? And why would he even be talking to them ex parte? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Another interesting thing is that the date on the alcohol blood test, either if the test or the results or whatever were fake, who knows, but the date on it claims that it was released before any of the tissue or blood samples were even taken. So the date on the tissue and blood samples taken from Henri Paul were actually dated after the so-called quote-unquote alcohol blood test. Now, you have to understand the alcohol blood test wasn't even a thing until the second inquest. So it looks like, documents are being backdated as part of a cover-up. Also, the blood samples taken from Henri Paul were actually contaminated, according to the official story, because apparently no one thought to refrigerate them. Now, this is a huge case. I mean, Princess Diana is no longer with us. This is a big deal. So they're expecting everyone to believe that blood samples were taken from this guy and someone just left them sitting around like, okay, whatever, we'll get to it later. So that's another huge red flag. Also, one of the unofficial blood tests, I guess, that was taken possibly at Henri Paul's, I don't know if it was an official autopsy or not, but one of the documents states that he had a 20% carbon monoxide blood content. And just him. No other occupants of the vehicle had that. So that is also something that we're going to get into in part 2, because Henri Paul had some connections to, some very sketch connections to intelligence agencies. And there's some really interesting things that we're going to get into at the end of this episode and also in part 2. So another huge red flag, while we're on the discussion of red flags, is that the CCTV tunnel footage, there's been conflicting reports about why that was never released and no one's ever seen it. Well, as it turns out, there were several different excuses and stories kind of coming out about that. The first one was that the cameras were broken, and when they couldn't back that up, someone from the French police or some French authorities said, oh no, they weren't broken, they were just turned off. Didn't even know you could do that. And if you could do that, why would you do that? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So then the third story about the cameras was that, oh, well, we had the camera footage, but now it's missing and we can't find it. And where have we heard that before? And then the fourth story about the tunnel camera footage was that it was accidentally erased. So yeah, we had it, but then someone erased it. Sorry, might be. We'll never know what the camera's footage had on it. And you have to understand, and one of the most important things to realize about this case is that there were thousands of pages of investigative material that have never been released. Why? What do they point to? What are they on about? So now let's hear from David Shaler, who is a former MI5 agent, and his theory about the crash and the wrongful death of Princess Diana.
It's very unlikely the Stevens report will come to definitive conclusions about certain evidence. The actual white Fiat Uno that was spotted hitting the black Mercedes in the tunnel has never been traced. A white Fiat Uno was traced to a paparazzo who was there on the day, someone called James Anderson, but he was found some months later, 250 miles from his home, in a burnt-out car. Now, the French concluded that was suicide, but suspicious people like me would say that has all the hallmarks of an intelligence service assassination. And certainly, he was telling his friends that he knew about the death of Princess Diana. So until we trace the white Fiat Uno that hit the black Mercedes, there will always be question marks over the death of Princess Diana. There'll always be question marks as well about why the CCTV cameras on the French roads were not working that night. And why, for example, Mohammed Al-Fayed, somebody tried to sell Mohammed Al-Fayed fake documents implicating the CIA and MI6. This was a guy called Oswald Lewinter, who I know was an MI6 disinformation agent. And that's what's known as a strawman operation, to tempt Mohammed Al-Fayed into using those documents to prove his case. But of course, when they were proved to be fakes, the whole case would have fallen apart. But I think the British people can see through these things as well. We've got to bear in mind the Hutton inquiry was an absolute whitewash. The Scott report in the 1990s into arms to Iraq gathered loads of very convincing evidence that there was wrongdoing. But the conclusions of these reports always give the intelligence service a clean bill of health, no matter what. And I know from talking to Mohammed Al-Fayed's security people that Henri Paul was not supposed to be driving them that night. He made the decision independently. There's a long line in this country of people, there being whitewash inquiries and so on. There's a lot of evidence that the Stevens inquiry won't be able to deal with, to do with things like, I say, the white Fiat Uno, the fact that Henri Paul was working for other intelligence services, the fact that the Mercedes itself was replaced at the last minute. We're expected to believe that a brand new Mercedes wouldn't start and was replaced with another one. So Tom Bauer's arguments about they wouldn't have had time to plan this, they could have quite easily done that. And we know that Princess Diana was to go to Palestine and start campaigning on behalf of the Palestinian people. And of course she took the world's media wherever she went. That would have meant that Israel, the state of Israel, would have been embarrassed to have cameras from the world's media showing how they are oppressing the Palestinian people, and they simply couldn't tolerate that. The only question really is who killed her. Was it Mossad or was it MI6?
And yet another reason why this show had to be broken into two parts. Apparently all roads lead to Palestine, and that is by all means a touchy subject for the Crown, obviously, and a sensitive topic nowadays for a lot of people. But basically, let's look into David Shaler's comments. Essentially, this guy Paul Anderson, who they found out was driving the white Fiat Uno, who we know at least clipped the side or the front corner of the Mercedes because of the white paint that some French officer had the brilliant idea of testing and found out that it was consistent with an Uno, and also the eyewitness testimony that a white Fiat Uno was present. But this guy Paul Anderson, who was supposedly a journalist or paparazzi, also, as you know, also shocker, newsflash, had ties to intelligence agencies. And the most interesting thing about him to me is that night he got on a plane and flew to Corsica at 3 a.m. Now, that's strange. I mean, and the only reasonable explanation that I've heard from people who believe the official story was that he had photographs of the crash and he was flying somewhere to sell them to someone. I don't know that you need to get on a plane at 3 a.m. to go to Corsica, no less, to sell. I mean, he was a photographer. He had a dark room. He had other, sources of developing film. Also, keep in mind, this is 97. I mean, we had digital ways of communicating at that time, so that was really suspect. And another thing that I've heard people bring up that have been a topic of conversation is, why were they even leaving the hotel? And my opinion on that, other than the fact that they just wanted to be back at Dodi's place to be more comfortable, to get away from paparazzi and everybody else, is basically that someone kept tipping off the paparazzi and the local police and everybody else. And it was an inside source, which I'm guessing was either Reese Jones or Henri Paul or whomever. But think about it this way: the longer that they are in the hotel, the larger the crowd outside is going to grow, and the harder it's going to be for them to leave eventually when they decide to leave. So when they make that snap decision to leave, I think it was because, they were thinking, hey, let's go ahead and get out of here before a massive crowd is outside. And I mean, anybody who's seen videos of celebrities and pop culture, icons, knows that those scenes can really be a zoo. Another thing that people bring up about the ring that he purchased for her, and were doubting, I don't know how you could possibly know this, but they were doubting that it was in fact a wedding ring. Common sense tells you this guy's got a lot of money. He could have bought her a lot of different things, but he decided to buy her a ring and then invite her to Paris, which has all the earmarks of a proposal. I don't know for sure. Maybe we'll never know. But again, his friends believed that was the case. His father, Mohammed, thought that was the case. And Diana's friends also believed that to be the case. So, it's easy for people to say that and say, well, just because he bought her a ring doesn't necessarily mean it was to propose, which is true. But again, very, very likely that he was planning to propose. You got to understand, this guy was in love. And if they've been friends for that long, maybe having affairs off and on, and he saw his opportunity and went for it. Now, I can understand that perfectly. Maybe some men can't, but I definitely can feel him on that. When you see something you want and you go right after it, I can relate to that. Maybe it's not always the best decision, but I feel where he's coming from. So in regards to the possible pregnancy, again, maybe she didn't even know. But I can tell you that there's no good reason to embalm a body prior to an autopsy. None. Unless you're trying to cover something up, in addition to it being very much against the law. Also, one of the stories that came out from the hospital personnel is that she was given a pulmonary massage for 2 hours and that she was on life support for a while. So for those things to be true, basically means that once she stabilized, she was never really out of danger, and that I've never heard of a 2-hour pulmonary massage. That's a long time to give someone a pulmonary massage. And I don't know of any documents that actually back that up. And if she was on life support, that means she either flatlined from the cardiac situations that the physician said was happening, but no one was able to confirm. So she either flatlined from that or someone pulled the plug. Again, there's a lot of things about that part of the inquest from the hospital that we actually don't know. The only thing we know for sure is that the so-called quote-unquote accident happened around midnight, and she arrived at the hospital around 2 a.m. Then she was pronounced dead. She was officially pronounced dead around 4 a.m. So a lot of mixed emotions there. And a lot of convoluted information that's been coming out since. But the one thing we know for sure is that embalming the body completely ruined any toxicology screen, which would have shown, any chemicals in her system that would have either induced cardiac arrest or killed her. We'll never know because she was embalmed. Also, the embalming ruined the pregnancy test. So let's take another mailbag break and hear from someone who has a question about the first responder on the scene.
Andrew from NC writes, I read somewhere back in the early 2000s that the traffic cop who was first on the scene reported that Diana was barely injured, and that person has since disappeared. Have you read or heard anything about that?
Thank you so much for listening, and that was a very good question. Apparently, there are conflicting stories of the first person who was on the scene. There's a story from a supposed eyewitness who said he was a doctor, and he was driving by in the other direction, and he saw the accident, and he ran over to see if he could help somehow, and he claimed that when he got over there, the rear passenger door was open. Diana was on her knees in the floor of the car behind the front seat, and that she muttered something, and there were paparazzi and photographers around taking pictures of her while she was saying, I don't know, she was saying something incoherently. That so-called eyewitness's testimony is a little suspect because he couldn't really remember anything after that about when they put her in the ambulance, what her condition was. And this is supposedly a doctor. So his testimony is a little bit sketch. The one thing that he said that seems to have been corroborated by others was that there were some paparazzi or photographers or whomever, press, someone around the car taking photos. So we've heard other people say that. The second, I guess you would say, official story witness of the first responder were these brothers who were volunteer firefighters. And I think this one goes back to the Stevens report. And one of the brothers, again, said that he went over to the car. He also corroborated that the door was open. The rear passenger side door was at least partially open, and that Diana was in there, but she was speaking, she was coherent, and that there were paparazzi around or someone taking photographs. So the thing that is suspect about this person's story is that he said that she had a very dramatic utterance before she supposedly collapsed prior to the ambulance getting there. So prior to any emergency medical care, he says that she gave this very dramatic, I can't remember what he said that she said. It was something like, "Oh my God, this is horrible," something very Shakespearean. And then she actually, according to this person, she collapsed. His story is sketched too, because after he said she collapsed, but prior to the arrival of the ambulance, he couldn't really get his story straight. I don't know why, if he was riding with his brother, that his brother also didn't come over, and I don't know why he didn't have any eyewitness testimony, but then again, maybe he did, and it's just one of the many documents that was left out of the investigation. So the supposed official, according to the story, according to the last inquest at least, and according to the French police, the first responder was a firefighter who basically didn't corroborate the story that the door was open. He also didn't mention any paparazzi being around. He said he went over to the car and she muttered, "Oh my God, what happened?" And then she collapsed, and he himself began to give her CPR. So those are all the conflicting stories of who was the first person on the scene. Again, originally the first person was a traffic cop, but that person cannot be found. We don't know what happened to him, if he's around, he's not talking, or if and maybe he did talk and he's not around as a result. We have no idea. So as of the 2007 inquest, there were more than 500 documents that inquest jury did not see, that they were not allowed to view. There were a total of 84 witnesses who were never heard from. And there were a verifiable 58 errors in the autopsy report alone. So a huge number of red flags here. I mean, when people talk about her being killed, it's not their imagination. There's a lot of meat on this bone. And in regards to the CCTV footage, again, the footage being erased or lost, or the camera's not working, I mean, you know, all that adds up to a lot of smoke, which eventually, I'm sure, leads to some type of fire. And speaking of CCTV footage, there's CCTV footage of the Ritz, which shows Henri Paul going in and out of the hotel several times. In fact, way too many times to account for anything that he was doing. Again, he didn't look like he was drunk. No one said he was drunk. And at one point it shows him, you know, he's tying his shoes. He's doing other things that if someone was a little tipsy, you could tell. Even someone who's a seasoned alcoholic, you know, you can kind of tell. So, you know, apparently, according to the hotel staff, there was none of that. But the CCTV footage at the hotel does reveal Henri Paul going in and out the revolving front door several times. So there's a lot of people who are of the opinion that he was in fact the one who was tipping off the paparazzi. He may have been the one who was in contact with intelligence agencies, and he might have also been the reason why the Mercedes were switched at the last moment. So with the camera footage from the opening of the tunnel being inaccessible, we cannot visually verify through documented evidence that the ramp from the tunnel, leading away from the tunnel, rather, was blocked, which is what several eyewitnesses said, which, by the way, is also in that document of the ideally planned assassination plot for a car to crash mysteriously in a tunnel. Part of that scenario is to block the exit that would lead away from the tunnel, forcing the automobile into the tunnel. There were several eyewitnesses that said the ramp was blocked by a vehicle. Some people said it was blocked by a motorcycle, which could have been one of the fake paparazzos, who knows. We also had witnesses who said it was blocked by some type of object. Now, the camera footage in front of the tunnel would have shown this, but of course, we didn't have access to that. But we have several corroborating eyewitnesses who gave that testimony. So I think the bottom line on that part is, if the official story, the original official story, if any part of it is correct, why did it take the French police so long to get the investigation going? Why did the French police ignore the leads to find all the drivers who were in the vicinity, possibly in the tunnel or either side of the tunnel, and get their statement, get their testimony, even if it was to back up the official story? I mean, the French authorities were very, very slow in moving to find out who was in the area. And to me, one of the biggest criteria to one of these sort of planned accidents or cover-ups is the actual crime scene itself being cleaned up and sanitized, which this was almost immediately. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the tunnel was open. The car had been towed away, the scene had been cleaned and sanitized, and the tunnel was open, completely destroying the crime scene. I mean, we're talking about the Princess of Wales here. Huge red flag when that happens. I mean, that's a no-no. Even if it was an accident, wouldn't the Mercedes Corporation want to know why a brand new Mercedes crashed and killed the princess? That seems like something they would want to know about. Wouldn't the traffic authority want to know what caused the accident. Maybe it was something faulty. Maybe something else happened in the tunnel. Who knows? But that's extremely suspicious. And also the French police took a very long time to even acknowledge that there was a white Fiat Uno involved, as well as the quote-unquote pursuing motorbikes who originally were supposed to be paparazzi. We don't know who they were now. You know, that could have been part of the intelligence operation. Who knows? The biggest mystery in all of this that will probably never be sorted out, the official traffic police report was excluded from the investigation. That is absolutely absurd and unheard of and very hard to believe.
Anonymous writes, why did it take so long for the ambulance carrying Diana to arrive at the hospital? Do you think Diana was actually killed in the ambulance?
That is a great question. Thank you again for listening. Why did it take so long for the ambulance carrying Diana to arrive at the hospital? Do I personally think that she was killed in the ambulance? Yes, I do. Now, again, keep in mind that under French law, and the medic regulations involving traffic accidents states that the accident victim must be given treatment on the spot prior to being placed in the ambulance, and that they at least have to be stabilized. Now, I don't get that, but you know, maybe someone who's listening to this is a physician or a medic who can give us some information about that and possibly either back up or debunk that as something that is actually a thing. Because the medics themselves are not, you know, surgeons, as it were, or heart specialists. However, the way the ambulance system works in France, there is sometimes a physician in the actual ambulance, which again leads me to believe that the length of time that it took to get to the hospital was part of a cover-up. Because if you have a physician in the ambulance, that's all the more reason to perform triage and to understand that you know, she would need medical care as quickly as possible. Even let's say she wasn't hurt at all. I mean, again, this is a Princess of Wales. You got to get her to the hospital. So there are a lot of detractors who are saying that yes, there would have been a physician in the ambulance and he would have made the call to go to another hospital that was further away. Again, keep in mind, the hospital that was even further away than the one that they didn't go to, which was 10 minutes away, was still about a max of 20 to 25 minutes away. So the hour and 45 minutes doesn't hold water unless they continually stopped. Now, again, if someone's a physician and can say why the ambulance either stopped seemingly every 5 or 10 minutes, probably closer to every 3 minutes, or drove so extremely slowly that it would take an hour and 45 minutes to get to the hospital. Again, if someone can shed light on that who is a licensed practicing physician, by all means, you're welcome to comment or email the show, and we will definitely discuss it on the next episode. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to get into more mailbag questions from listeners.
This episode is sponsored by Bamboo 92 FM, listener-supported community radio, featuring all-time classics, unreleased mixtapes, theme weekends, DJ sets, podcasts, and interviews. Featuring 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s genre hits, plus soul, rocksteady, jump blues, ska, swing, hip-hop, garage, jazz, rhythm and blues, mod, hip shaker, new wave, alt-rock, old-time gospel, house, breakbeat, root step, drum and bass, and several more. Follow the link in the description to subscribe to the YouTube channel or visit bamboo92.com. Be sure to donate to our Patreon for exclusive access and private listening parties. You can also purchase gear and book your theme parties and events via PayPal.
Thank you, Ali. Welcome back to the show. And yes, indeed, we thank Bamboo 92 FM for sponsoring this episode. Yours truly is also an on-air personality on Bamboo 92, where you can find the original and world-famous Soundboy show hosted by yours truly, Soundboy Skep. So I want to get to a mailbag question that I thought was really interesting before we continue with some of the theories and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of Princess Diana. This was a theory that I had heard before and didn't think much about it, but the more I think about it, the more plausible that it may become.
Lauren from LA writes, do you think there's a possibility that Diana and Dodi somehow faked their death so they could escape the royal family and MI6?
So the question about this possibly being Diana and Dodi faking their deaths to get away, I'm assuming to get away from the Windsors, but also possibly to be getting away from the paparazzi and the notoriety and the tabloids and all that. When I first heard that, I really didn't think too much of it. Could be part of a weird cover story to keep people from investigating or looking into it further. But in some ways, it does kind of hold water. The problem is it's such a public place, and it's in such a way that people are going to investigate regardless. Now, to me, if you said that, for example, they went out on the yacht and got lost at sea, that scenario is much more in tune with you faking your death to not be bothered or to get away from it all. I don't know why Di would do that unless she thought that there were people who could seriously keep a secret, because she's not going to leave her boys. I mean, she was a good mom. Now, by all accounts, those boys are jerks, especially now that they're grown, but she's not going to leave them. I mean, and if they knew, then that means other people would know. Now, I think the Al Fayeds could have probably kept it a secret. You know, they have money. They have, means at their disposal. So, had it come from that side, maybe. Lost at sea in a yacht or a boat, I could buy that. Maybe a cover story or something that they drowned and then they didn't really drown. They just went to an island or something to fake their death. Maybe I could buy that. But a car crash in the middle of Paris is not ideal for trying to fake your own death for obvious reasons. So, I mean, I don't know. I think that's a little bit sketch just based on the circumstances. So now let's hear from former MI5 agent Annie Machon, and she's got some very interesting theories about the wrongful death in the car crash that killed Princess Diana.
The reason I want to raise this particularly with personal experience of the case, I mean, I know there's all sorts of speculation about what really happened and was Henri Paul drunk and, why they took the route they did. It was completely circuitous. But David and I had personal involvement in it. Apart from the timing, which really screwed our lives over for about a year afterwards. About 2 months after her death, we had a mysterious phone call. And it turned out it was Mohammed Al Fayed, who wanted us to go to Paris and look at some documents he'd been offered. So, at this point, we're living in a very remote farmhouse. Black Ritz Mercedes comes to pick us up and take us to Paris. And almost crashes twice. So that could have been a good headline. Anyway, we look at the documents. He's been offered these for sale from a guy who's very vague about how he got hold of them. Oswald the Winter. That's the one. These were documents purporting to prove that there was CIA and MI6 involvement in Diana's death. And they looked good. But if you knew what a document really looked like, what a proper MI6 document looked like, there were some simple errors, things like the date timeline, things like the addressee list, they just weren't quite right. They were forgeries, they were very good forgeries. And this would have been a classic strawman technique. Al Fayed was asked for $20 million for these documents and probably would have paid if they were real, because he was desperate to prove that there was a plot against his son and his possible future daughter-in-law. Anyway, we saw that they were forgeries, they were fakes, and it saved him $20 million, but also saved him embarrassment. This would have been a classic straw man operation, whereby he would have bought them, held them up to the world's media and said, look, I've got proof. And then the authorities would have turned around and said, look, so obvious, look at these simple errors, of course they're forgeries. You can imagine what would have happened. Anything else he ever found out, he would have been dismissed as a fantasist. So, his entire campaign for justice for his son would have stalled pretty much before it started. Anyway, as the lady down there said, the guy who was trying to flog him these documents was a well-known con man called Oswald or Oscar Lewinter. He was also notoriously an MI6 agent. He was quite well known. Most agents were pretty, their identities were quite tightly held. He was pretty well known, though, because he seemed to get involved in all sorts of dodgy activities. So that, to us, proved that there was an MI6 interest in this. And then, of course, we started looking at the other evidence and all the rest of it. And I have to say, my personal opinion, I think, yes, they did intend to at least seriously injure or kill her. And it's not just about the fact that, was she pregnant, wasn't she? We'll never know, because they embalmed her against all French law so quickly. And all the other speculative things you see in the press. It's also the fact that it was reported that she was being a great success in the landmine campaign that she was running. Yes. But also, she was about to go into campaigning on the behalf of the Palestinians. Now, you can imagine someone of Princess Diana's profile doing that. They would not have tolerated it. They could not have dealt with that. So I think that's why she was taken out. I think they'd probably been planning it for a while, and it was just perfect timing. They did it when they did.
That was Annie Machon, a former MI5 agent, speaking at a conference regarding the death of Princess Diana. Again, all roads seem to lead back to Palestine, which is bad news for the royal family and the UK government and the intelligence agencies and a lot of other people if Princess Di began to campaign on behalf of the Palestinians, especially if she had lived until today and witnessed the obvious atrocities that are occurring in Palestine and the very obvious genocide, which we're not really allowed to speak very much about, but this is just regular people talking. I mean, if you can imagine Princess Diana talking about the Palestinian genocide, which is very much in her wheelhouse because she already has successful campaigns in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, getting rid of landmines because apparently children would just go out to play, step on landmines and blow themselves to pieces. And we don't cotton to that, She didn't dig that, so she got involved. And she was actually a very, very beautiful woman with a beautiful soul. And you can very easily see why she was in the way. And from certain people's perspective, she had to be eliminated. But getting back to the investigation and the most likely cover-up, Trevor Rees-Jones, again, was the only one to survive this car crash. And he wrote a book, or he had a book ghostwritten, and it is garbage. It is 100% disinformation. And when I say it's garbage, I'm not insulting the guy. I mean, the book is not a good book. When you hire somebody to ghostwrite a book, it's supposed to be good. Because, if someone's not a writer and you say, hey, can you write this book for me? You would think at least the book is going to be well written, even if what's in it is complete BS. But it's not a good book. But again, this guy's head of security. The one thing that he was supposed to do before they left to go to Dodi Al-Fayed's apartment was to check Diana's seatbelt. And he either didn't do it, or against everything in the universe, she said, no, don't worry about it, or it was broken, or it was defective. Again, keep in mind, they switched Mercedes at the last minute. And if she got in the back seat, clicked that seatbelt, not knowing that it was defective, then nothing would have appeared to be wrong. Again, I think Trevor Rees's testimony is that she just didn't wear it, which is, again, completely absurd. And so, Reese Jones and a lot of these other people having ties to intelligence organizations, again, is a part of the huge red flag that probably started everybody, down the rabbit hole in this mystery. In fact, there is credible evidence that Khan, Diana's boyfriend, apparently, the guy she was dating prior to Dodi, had MI6 connections. Also, think about this. This is something that I haven't heard anywhere else, but it could be plausible. If she was pregnant, there's nothing to say that it wasn't Khan's baby. I mean, they dated for a while, and she dated him right before she got with Dodi, so who knows? Maybe that's all a part of it. But there are also a lot of questions that are just, never got answered. For example, why did Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, buy the Villa Windsor in Paris? Now, that's like supposedly the royal family's vacationing home in Paris. But apparently it was up for sale. And a lot of people believe, and I also, agree with them, that he bought them that house. He bought the house for Dodi and Diana as a wedding gift. And he intended for them to either live there or, honeymoon there. Either way, I mean, it's a friggin' house in Paris. I mean, come on. But the timing of his purchase of the house is definitely in line with Diana's thinking that, she needed, at the very least, some type of protection from, intelligence agencies, the royal family, et cetera, et cetera. So, if she was going to the Al-Fayeds for protection from the Windsors, that would make a lot of sense. Basically just ask Jeffrey Epstein. Oh, wait, you can't. He's dead. Another person who died under mysterious circumstances, who had a lot of ties to the Windsors and who could open a lot of doors and talk about a lot of secrets that the royal family were involved in, which, again, we're going to get into that in part 2 of the episode. But again, I feel like Dodi was simply madly in love with Diana, and he knew that they didn't have a lot of time. They were running out of time because of this very thing. I'm sure he had heard the rumors that, MI6 was involved, possibly the French Secret Service was involved, and possibly even the CIA, and they had plans on paper for assassination scenarios of this, type of thing. So, when you love someone and you feel like you don't have a lot of time, you're going to go right after it, especially if you have money and the means to, pull it off. And Mohammed Al-Fayed has talked openly. He talked about Dodi being unhappy, and now this is unpleasant stuff for, Dodi's children and his ex-wife to hear about. But I mean, hey, everyone gets that. If you're unhappy, you're unhappy. If you meet someone, you meet someone. Is it going to be messy? Yes. For us regular folk, it's messy. I mean, you can imagine how messy it's going to be for someone who is formerly a member of the royal family and someone who is, of the Egyptian aristocracy, as it were. So things get messy. Granted, I don't know that they believe that things would get this particularly messy, because this is pretty damn messy. So basically, there's one theory that I've had that I want to get to before we get to the final mailbag questions. And this is a big part of the reason why it took so long to get this episode together. There is evidence, brace yourself, there is evidence that Henri Paul, the driver of Diana's Mercedes, was actually a Manchurian candidate. So for those of you who are not familiar with Manchurian candidates, if you've never seen the film or read anything about it, basically it's very similar to things that we have read and seen and heard about in MK Ultra and other mind control programs. Essentially, Manchurian candidates are basically transformed into a trance-like state via some type of trigger, and they, perform acts that they are pre-programmed to perform. The most famous supposed Manchurian candidate is Sirhan, the guy who was reported to shoot RFK. And we'll get into that in the RFK show, and it's really, really interesting. More shots were fired than his gun was capable of firing. The gunshot residue test showed that the distance of the muzzle of the gun was only a few inches from RFK's ear, and Sirhan never got anywhere near that close. The most compelling thing about Sirhan being a possible Manchurian candidate to me was when the football player Rosie Greer, he was there in the kitchen when it occurred, and he was one of the first people who sort of tackled Sirhan, and he described Sirhan's hand as being like stone, like a statue, and he couldn't pry the gun from his hand. And at the same time, Sirhan had the most calm, relaxed look on his face, but he was so dead-eyed. You know, there was no hate or violence. It was just this stone stare. And I mean, I imagine Rosie Greer is a pretty strong guy, and he couldn't get the gun out of Sirhan's hand. And both he and several other witnesses reported that Sirhan looked like he was in a trance-like state. So if Henri Paul was some type of Manchurian candidate and he got some type of trigger, it would explain why he was going in and out of the revolving door of the hotel so many times. That could have been part of his program. That would also explain why he was so casually speaking to paparazzi out front, which is like, I mean, why would you be doing that unless you were either getting information or giving information? But that's not his job. I mean, he's security. He's supposed to be, you know, doing other things. Also, think about that last supposed photo that was taken before the crash. I mean, Henri Paul's eyes were like a shark's eyes. I mean, he looked like a doll. I mean, it was just like his pupils were dilated. He was staring straight ahead. In addition to that, why were the French police or the French authorities not interested in whomever supposedly took that photo? Because the original story was the person who took that photo was the paparazzi who supposedly caused the accident in the first place. I personally think that Henri Paul was a Manchurian candidate. I think a flashbang grenade was used, which is corroborated by eyewitness testimony. I don't know if it was the motorcycle driver. I don't know if it was the Fiat Uno driver. I have no idea. But I do think that that was part of the scenario, which was pre-planned. Also, no one ever talks about this guy Anderson, who apparently the French police claim that he committed suicide. He was found in a burnout car, and he was shot in the head, and the car was locked. So the story that the French police put out was that this guy apparently got in the car, locked the door, shot himself, and then poured gasoline on the outside. Or, let's see, maybe he poured gasoline on the outside of the car, lit it like super quick, then jumped in the front seat, shot himself. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Jumped in the front seat, put his seatbelt on while the car was on fire, shot himself, and, oh, wait, no, he had to lock the door first. So jumped in the front seat, put on the seatbelt, locked the door, and shot himself, and then the car burned up. Either way, that stuff is just, it's too incredible to be true, but they're asking you to believe that type of thing. Another thing in relation to Henri Paul possibly being a Manchurian candidate is the 6 degrees of separation. And this is where it gets a little tricky, because while I was doing some research for the show, I actually stumbled upon some very, very compelling evidence that links the Egyptair 990 crash, which was off, I believe, Manhattan in 1999, to one of the very same intelligence agency scenarios. A lot of people believe that the Egyptair 990 pilot was also a Manchurian candidate. because he grabbed the stick and pushed it straight down and plunged the plane into the ocean. A lot of people jumped on this guy's back trying to pull him off the stick, but they couldn't. And he just decided out of the blue to grab the stick and push it straight down. But the mystery and the rabbit hole goes a lot deeper. It doesn't stop there, because during the Egypt Air 990 crash, this guy who grabbed the stick, pushed it straight down, also reached over and turned off something called the fuel selector valve switch. Okay? The only reason to do that is to kill the fuel to the engines, which assures that you won't be able to get the plane started again, definitely not get it leveled off. Now, again with the 6 degrees of separation, and brace yourself for this, the same exact thing happened in the JFK Jr. plane crash in 1999 as well. Whatever scenario you believe about that crash, as they were plummeting towards the ocean, someone reached over and turned off the fuel selector valve switch, which kills the fuel to the engine. Now, there's credible evidence that there was in fact a co-pilot in that crash, and that there was no evidence that JFK Jr. told everybody he wanted to do it alone, and that, you know, he and his wife, who was also possibly pregnant, that's another irony, that, you know, he and his wife were fighting and he wanted to fly alone and he didn't know how to fly. I mean, none of that was true. He was a seasoned pilot. He knew what he was doing. There was contact with the Martha's Vineyard control tower that they were almost on final approach. So all of this happened, you know, almost last minute. So the one big weird mystery about the JFK Jr. plane crash is that the co-pilot's seat is actually missing when they got the plane out and was doing, you know, they were doing the plane crash investigation where they lay everything out in a really big garage, and they found that the actual seat was missing. So there's a lot of evidence that someone came along, and whomever the co-pilot was, who could have easily grabbed the stick, pushed it forward, and turned off the fuel selector valve, the actual seat itself, which had to have been in the plane when it took off, was not there. So someone could have easily come by in a ship or even a small boat with a winch and pulled that person out who was still strapped into that seat. Those are big coincidences, that these Manchurian candidates are involved in these so-called scenarios and plots to assassinate people, and that, you know, the same idea of this thing happening could be part of that much of a 6 degrees of separation. Also consider this, and remember when I told you to remember the fact that Dodi Al-Fayed ran a successful production company. I found evidence, which has since completely disappeared, that basically is a link to the Princess Diana car crash by someone who was on Egypt Air Flight 990, who was related somehow to the Al-Fayed family. And they supposedly had either found or discovered or pieced back together the CCTV camera footage from the tunnel. And that person was on the plane. Now, a lot of people think, oh, why would you crash a whole plane to kill one guy? Yeah, they would. I mean, they did the same thing in Lockerbie, Scotland. They blew up an entire plane to get 1 or 2 guys. That's not unheard of. I mean, we're talking about the CIA here. They kill lots of people all the time for sometimes very little or no reason. So is it plausible? Yes, I think it is. The problem is, a lot of that evidence that I found, first of all, the online evidence that I found has since been completely obliterated. More alarmingly than that, the evidence that I myself collected has disappeared. Now, if I threw it away, I sure don't remember it. But again, I have no knowledge of the whereabouts of that evidence that I collected that shows that there was someone on Egypt Air Flight 990 who was related to the events of the mysterious and wrongful death of Princess Diana. So for now, it's just a theory, but it's a very interesting theory. because we're talking about these Manchurian candidates, and we're talking about intelligence agencies and lots of spycraft and people being assassinated. I mean, there's something to it. And I think that the Egypt Air 990 connection is really scary. The Milosevic assassination plot being something they were already working on is really scary. And the possible JFK Jr. connection is really scary. You got to understand, I mean, had he lived, he would have absolutely crushed, Bush or McCain or whomever else, was running for president in 2000. And I mean, the popular vote is utter nonsense. The Electoral College is so absurd, there's no reason to even talk about it. But these are more appointments than they are elections. But in any case, they wouldn't have had a choice. He would have gotten that job. So a lot of interesting stuff. And we'll definitely get there in some subsequent episodes. So now we're going to close out the show with some mailbag questions that maybe we didn't get to before. So we have one here from Anonymous. Why were James Hewitt and Paul Burrell smeared? Was it to discredit them for anything that they might say? I believe so, especially James Hewitt. See, another question is James Hewitt the youngest boy's pop? I think so. He looks just like him, the redhead kid. Harry, I think, the one who wore the Nazi stuff to the party. Yeah, James Hewitt looks exactly like James Hewitt. That's probably his pop. I mean, again, Diana's running to these people for protection. And, James Hewitt clammed right up, after all this happened. And he didn't want to say anything. Now, he denied, obviously, that he was the kid's pop. But, I mean, what else would you expect him to say? Do I think that Hewitt or Burrell or anyone was threatened by the Windsors or MI5? Yes, I do. I think that that's standard operating procedure for the intelligence agencies and the royal family. Another question is, why did the French and British security forces claim that they never spied on Diana and had no idea or no knowledge at all that she was in Paris that weekend? Well, that's an obvious lie. I mean, they were keeping tabs on her the whole time. I don't know why they would go out of their way to deny something like that was so, obviously provable as false. The biggest question of all, why did neither the French nor the British ever seriously consider that something suspicious had happened late that night or early the next morning? And that definitely says it all. I mean, again, even if it was just an accident, you got to look into it for no other reason than maybe the car had a malfunction. Maybe something was wrong in the tunnel. Maybe Henri Paul wasn't feeling well and he had a stroke. There's so many reasons to look, into this, but instead they hauled the car off, they cleaned up the debris and the glass, swept everything down, hosed it down with high pressure hoses, and opened the tunnel right back up. So to me, that's definitely a cover up. To me, that is definitely signs that something has gone wrong. We have reached the end of this episode of the Open Homicide Podcast. Thank you again very much for listening. Be sure to stay tuned for part 2 of this episode. So thanks again for your support. Be sure to stream the show on your favorite devices. Be sure to also subscribe to the Open Homicide YouTube channel and check out openhomicide.com. Once again, I'm Skip Pulley. Thank you so much for listening.